Welcome to Savage Minds. Today's guest is Boaventura de Sousa Santos, an Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Coimbra in Portugal and distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is widely renowned for and has written and published extensively on the issues of globalization, sociology of law and the state, epistemology, social movements, and the World Social Forum. Among his many books in English, Law and the Epistemologies of the South, From the Pandemic to Utopia, The Future Begins Now, Decolonizing the University, The Challenge of Deep Cognitive Justice, and Toward a New Legal Common Sense, Law, Globalization, and Emancipation, Boaventura de Sousa Santos has been awarded several internationally acclaimed awards, most recently the Franz Fanon Lifetime Achievement Award by the Caribbean Philosophical Association, the Science and Technology Prize of Mexico, the Calvin Jr. Prize of the Law and Society Association, the Adam Podgoreszki Prize from the International Sociological Association, the Djibouti Prize in the area of Human Sciences and Education, and the Gulbenkian Science Prize. He has also been awarded 21 honorary degrees from universities around the world. I welcome Boaventura de Sousa Santos to Savage Minds. I am so happy to have you on the show, and I'm a big fan of your work. I wanted to kick off with a bit about your life and your move from your origins, I guess, from studying criminal law to criminology, and then from this to the sociology of law, and then to sociology. Can you explain to our listeners about your journey to include your studies in Germany during the height of the Cold War, and how this has informed your approach both to your writing and academic work?
Okay, Julian, it's a great pleasure to be in your podcast. It's an interesting question. It's the question of my life. I am a working class kid. I was the first working class kid to enter the School of Law at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. So you can imagine at the time how elitist the university was. And then I was, probably the best student in the law school. And at the time, if you were a very good student, then you'd become assistant professor. And I became an assistant professor in 1965. But then I got, precisely because of my grades, I got a grant to go to Germany to study in the Free University, which was an American university that had been created after the war. And I was very excited. I had learned German. I mastered at the time already 4 or 5 languages, and I felt that it would be a very good opportunity for me. So I was an assistant professor in criminal law, but in fact I was not much interested because, in a sense, I wanted to study science, and legal dogmatics or jurisprudence was not for me a science. Was a technique of interpretation of legal arguments and so on. And I want to move into, a more sociologically and philosophically oriented type of study of law. And that's what I did at the Free University, or Freie Universität as it was called. I started with the philosophy of law. And it was a great experience for me because I spent almost 2 years in West Berlin. But in fact, the real university was the Humboldt University, which was on the other side, in the Soviet side of Berlin. So because I was a foreigner, I could cross the wall every day on the condition that I wouldn't stay for more than 24 hours. And so much so that, in fact, my first girlfriend was from the Soviet zone. So I would cross that very often, both for personal and professional reasons. So that was my study. It was probably a very enriching experience because I I was coming from a dictatorship. As you know, Portugal was a fascistic dictatorship until 1975 and then 1974. And so for me, the West Berlin was, the experience of a democratic society in a sense. But on the other side of the wall, I had the Soviet society, and that was a very difficult period for East Germany because it was the Stalinistic period of Walter Ulbricht. And it was really all kinds of difficulties and, of people for essential goods, so to say, and food, chocolates and tobacco and so on. And I would smuggle a lot of them to the Soviet zone, to my friends, and to the family of my girlfriend. And so it was a difficult period that even though I was already a left intellectual, I decided very early on that that was not the regime I would like to have. I would like to be probably to have a socialist regime, but what I saw in East Berlin was very much similar to what I had seen in Portugal. So that was the reason why probably I didn't become a communist at the time, even though I read a lot of the books because whenever you'd cross the wall, the Soviet side would offer us the complete works of Lenin, of Marx, and so on. So we had lots of collections. Never of Trotsky, of course, as you can imagine, was never distributed to us. So I spent that period there. It was a very enriching experience. Then I came back to Portugal, and then the dictatorship was still there, and I couldn't stand the regime, and therefore my training in philosophy of law had led me to the sociology of law in a sense, because also it was a very traditional, very classical type of philosophy of law, which in fact was not allowing me to see the real stuff of law in action, so to say. And that's why in 1969 I got a grant to go to the United States. I got a grant to go both to Yale, to Harvard, and to Philadelphia. But since my then wife was already there, in fact, my wife started her PhD in 1968 at Yale, and she was studying literature under Harold Bloom. I decided, of course, to choose the grant from Yale University, and I spent the next 4 years of my life there. And what I wanted, in fact, there was sociology of law. And from there, it was very easy to move to sociology in general, because we could see that without understanding the general theory of sociology, it would be impossible to study the sociology of law. And in fact, some of the very important sociologists of the time, like Max Weber, they had studied law. In fact, they were lawyers also in the beginning. So it was a very rich experience because the United States at the time was a very, very open and free society, conflictual society. You have to understand, I arrived at the movement at the moment of the struggles against the war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement. That's when I met, the Black Panther Power, Angela Davis, all these people who come to Yale, and it was a very, very transformative type of period because about 4 years of my life, and that's where I became a Marxist, and I strengthened my political and my philosophical training and sociological training. And then in 1973, I was interviewed to stay at the University of New York in Buffalo to teach sociology of law. But then I came to Portugal to say, because I had news that the dictatorship was falling apart, and it was almost the end of the regime. And in fact, that was the case. So I arrived a few months before the revolution, and the revolution, the Carnation Revolution, as it became known, in 1974, brought back democracy to Portugal after 48 years. Well, as you can imagine, there was no sociology worth of the name in Portugal at the time, because the dictator, Salazar, always thought that sociology and socialism were the same. So sociology was forbidden, was studied in law and economics, but not sociology. So I started, in a sense, I'm the number three, the member number three of the Portuguese Sociological Association, and I started at the School of Economics, where in the Department of Sociology, and I led, in fact, founded the School of Economics in Coimbra. And then it was, the rest of my life was really in this area. And since it was very stressing to be launching a new country, in a sense, after 48 years of dictatorship. I was at the time 34 years of age, so, and two small kids. I really decided, my wife was also teaching at university, I managed to get an arrangement of a kind of a joint appointment between the School of Economics in Coimbra and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, because my former teachers at Yale, some of them were in Wisconsin, and I liked Wisconsin in general. I had been there before in Madison, so I moved there, and so from then on, for 35 years, I spent half of my time in Madison, Wisconsin, during the fall term. For many years I taught, then I did my research. I'm still affiliated to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the rest of the time in Portugal.
Over the years, you mention the changes in your life and even politically. Marxism forms the basis of that. Yet, how have your views changed over the years from living in Berlin to the present to include the more recent inflections of identity politics that have popped up in what the identitarians, as I call them, they often consider themselves part of the left, but from where I'm standing, I am a Marxist. I look at them and I see very little Marxist about a lot of these identities that are based not on anything real, material. There's no historical materialism. In fact, a lot of these identity politics that have popped up over the last 20, 30 years have been based on this kind of atomized sense of identity, where it's all about the individual, rarely, if ever, the group. And when it is the group, it's about, again, a fictional identity of I identify as, where the rest of society, and if you follow what's been happening with the trans movement, for instance, in England, it's fascinating because it's not really about the rights of this group of people, because they have the same rights as any one of us. It's about their right to insist that we see them as they see themselves, that we use their language. And there's a kind of ideological doxa at heart, which I find not at all leftist. In fact, I find it quite worrying and a bit totalitarian, if I might say. Yet the same people are the ones rubbing shoulders or part of Antifa who say that they are leftists. So we're in this kind of crisis, I'm sure you've noticed this, where leftists are having to deal with this kind of fake doppelgangers who aren't leftists at all, but are using our language. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but absolutely, Julian. I agree with your analysis. I think that this new turn, perverse turn on identity politics, and I'll explain in a moment why I think that is a perversity. In fact, they are useful idiots, as Lenin you'd call them, of the extreme right and of the rightists. They are contributing to the suicide of the left. I think that of course, as Marxists, we always had an idea of belongingness, and this idea of belongingness was the class. the class struggle, and of course the oppressed and the oppressors, and the class identity was very important. The class consciousness, particularly, which was very difficult to establish in different countries. If you analyze the African versus the European countries, or even the Marxist analysis of classes after 1867, when he left this 30,000 non-published material, which now we have access to, and you can see how complex Marx was as a theoretician. So, but always at the core was the idea of this large belonging to the group that were dominated by capitalism and by exploitation, and this remains, as far as I am. This remains the essential feature. Well, in the after 2000, there was a very important event in my life, and this event was the World Social Forum. I was one of the founders, the enthusiasts, and so on, behind the idea, because I had worked in the 90s, in the 80s. I have done field work in Cape Verde Islands, in the 90s in Colombia. My doctoral thesis at Yale was done by living in a favela, in a squatter settlement in Rio de Janeiro in 1970. So I always felt that the idea Marxism had to be quite flexible to account for these different realities. And then in 2001, there was this World Social Forum. It was a moment in which we were trying to launch progressive politics around the world. We knew that was the Economic Forum at Davos, and there was the idea that the oppressed, the class struggles, workers and other people that felt oppressed could also have their own World Forum, which would be the World Social Forum, which in fact met precisely at the same time as the Economic Forum in Davos in January. Well, it was a great success. It was the first one was in 2001 in Porto Alegre, and then for the next 3 years was in Porto Alegre in Brazil, and then we moved to other countries. We're in Nairobi, in Dakar, in Mumbai, in several countries. And finally, in fact, the last one was in 2016 in Montreal. So the World Social Forum forced me or led me to see that my concept of class struggle had to be more complex. And the complexity was the fact that there were people that, in fact, they were not, well, we already knew of formal and material domination and the concepts in Marx, but we could see that there were groups with other types of language, other types of narratives. The repertoire of struggles was very diverse. When we saw peasant, women, lesbian, religious peoples from different countries using very different languages and all coming together. So I felt at the time that, in fact, our concept of class struggle had to be expanded and had to be densified. My idea was to densify the class struggle. And the way I did it was to say that, in fact, our domination in our time is not just capitalism as exploitation, is also colonialism and patriarchy. So, and why these two? Well, because colonialism was very clear for the people that had worked in the so-called Third World at the time it was called. Colonialism didn't end with independence. On the contrary, it continued under new forms, imperialism and neocolonialism, internal colonialism. Neocolonialism was Kwame Nkrumah, the first one to denounce it, and internal colonialism Pablo González Casanova in Mexico, 1965, at the same time. So the colonialism was there. So there was the origin of the decolonial studies, which for me were always a little bit problematic because, in fact, colonialism was there. We didn't live in post-colonial societies, but we could not have an approach as a Marxists as just negative. Decolonial, post-colonial is negative. Where are the positive side of our proposal? And that's where, very early on, I developed, right after the World Social Forum, the idea of the epistemologies of the South, which is the positive side of this. And the positive side was that, in fact, we should acknowledge the idea that domination in our world was based on these three main dominations, because I saw many people that were not formally workers, but they were oppressed by racism and so on, and the indigenous people by the expropriation of their land. And therefore, colonialism was there as a kind of a permanent primitive accumulation, which was the idea of Rosa Luxemburg and then of David Harvey. So the idea that colonialism was present there, and without colonialism, capitalism could not exist. Could exist as a mode of production, but could not exist as a social formation, because colonialism needed highly underdeveloped or devalued work, like the immigrants today, like slaves before, today the immigrants. So it's very much the same thing. And the patriarchy, I was very much influenced by Silvia Federici and the idea that non-paid labor was very important for the reproduction of capitalism. And in fact, we as Marxists, we had been trapped in the idea that the women's work was reproductive work, while it is highly productive, produce children, food, care, and so on. But we considered it as reproductive because it was not salaried labor, was not paid labor. So I felt that these three dominations could enrich the class struggle. We could, in fact, bring them together. And therefore, there was all the anti-capitalist struggle should be also anti-racist struggle, anti-colonial struggle, and anti-patriarchal struggle. As you can see, this is the theoretical side of what I was witnessing in practice, working with social movements in the World Social Forum. I saw them coming together, and I saw that this is what we have to do. Well, as you just described, things didn't turn out as we thought, and on the contrary, instead of densifying the class struggle very easily, neoliberalism used not just colonialism, not much, because colonialism has a kind of a material economy very strong, like today, a political economy basis, which is the need for what they call natural resources, which are also human resources. And more than ever, we are now at a period of recolonizing, not a period of decolonizing. On the contrary, we are recolonizing the world. We, I say, the developed capitalist countries. And I felt that in the case of patriarchy, things went wrong because neoliberalism took that flag from us and saw there, in fact, in the United States, also racism had also started there at the beginning, the identity politics, the idea that, in fact, the identity politics would separate itself from the anti-capitalist struggle. And all of a sudden, capitalism disappears from the discourse and from the practice. And people start to identify with identities that are not based on the only identity that we felt would be the basic identity, which was the class and the class struggle. So, and that was the perversity of our time. And yeah, now, particularly in the case of patriarchy, we are seeing the neoliberal appropriation of the identity politics funded by large organizations. The three of them have been the USAID, Ford Foundation, and George Soros, the Open Society. These people, particularly my experience in Latin America, shows me very clearly they are really funding all this movement of women, usually middle class white women, uh, on the premise that they will never touch the idea of social inequality created by capitalism. In fact, my guru of the 70s, Gloria Steinem, when we discovered that this woman was a CIA agent in the 70s, it was quite a shock for me. And the terms of reference were very clear. You never touch the question of capitalism. She has confessed that publicly, so it's not my speculation. So this is the perversity. And from here, we move to the idea of narcissism, of belongingness, that in fact is the basis of extreme right politics, which is the idea of us and them, and therefore the creation of the enemy. And with the enemy, we don't discuss, we destroy him or destroy her. We don't discuss. So it is also an attack against democracy with all the limitations that liberal democracy has and our societies, which are, you know, as I usually say, they are politically democratic but socially fascistic. And I think that now many of them are becoming also politically fascistic, like the United States. So I think that that was this perversity of turning identity politics into a kind of a narcissistic type of individualism, which is that's what it is, of self-slavery, of the uberized economics, in which people in fact feel that they are autonomous, and when in fact they are overexploited and with no rights actually, and therefore a period again of primitive accumulation of a new type. So the violence is back, and the identity politics is the disguise, the main disguise to be tolerated in a democratic society, this form of extreme exploitation that is only possible under dictatorship. And and we do that in democratic societies because we manage to give the flavor, the disguise of a progressive struggle, which in fact is playing out the game of the right with a very serious danger for the struggles of liberation. Why? Because in fact, well, I've worked all my life with the women's struggle, but in fact, not the white middle class struggle, but with indigenous women and with black women and Afro American women in Latin America. Even today, well, yesterday, I was in contact with a good friend of mine, Blanca Chancoso, is a great leader of the indigenous people in Ecuador. They are Otavalos. And as you can see, as you probably know, Daniel Noboas, which is a rightist, corrupt president now, is attacking the Otavalo people. And I was really very concerned that her family and herself would be in danger because they have been attacked by the police, and there are already 2 or 4 people dead, and others are seriously wounded. So this is the struggle of the real women and that are really suffering not just one, but 3 modes of domination because they are poor and because they are indigenous or are black. And these are the women that were my model. I learned with them. Blanca Chancoso was like Mariela Shockway in Bolivia. They were the people with whom I learned how these struggles were invisible, because my experience in Latin America had been very traumatic in this respect, because I have seen um, parties in the 90s in Colombia and in Ecuador. I had seen parties, socialist parties, that were very racist and very sexist. They would, they would not even admit the idea that there are indigenous people. They said that they are peasants and they are minors, but not indigenous people. And women, they're the same, so they were completely absent. So it was for us a great advancement to bring in, to densify, that was the idea, to make it more complex. Because if united struggles, we become stronger. Because capitalism has always survived by dividing people. Well, that's what they are doing. The left is committing suicide in Portugal. The left is committing suicide in Spain. The left is committing suicide in any country now that I know. Some countries are struggling to get some unity, like in Brazil now, because of the experience of the extreme right Bolsonaro that they had. In Argentina, you see how the left also committed suicide in a sense, and now they are in the hands of a crazy neoliberal guy, Milei. So, what can we do? It's really, Julian, we are at a period, a very complex period of defensive struggles. Everywhere I go, even this struggle now in Ecuador, I'm helping from here. I'm trying to help the struggle by bringing the attention of the Europeans to the Equatorian struggle, because we have been and very well concentrated in the Palestinian and the Gaza genocide, but there are other struggles going on, and this we have to continue to make them visible, because there are no news about this. So these people are not struggling for new rights. They are struggling not to lose the rights that they had before. So that's what I call a period of defensive struggles. And I think that sooner or later we have to turn to offensive struggles, because we cannot go on for long just with defensive struggles, because we are becoming more and more controlled and in fact neutralized, silenced, and neutralized by all the perversities of our time.
I would like to address this because, ironically, I didn't realize you were at Yale in the 70s. So you were there at the same time that Camille Paglia was there, studying with Harold Bloom, I presume.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Fascinating, because, as you well know, she is much reviled amongst feminists. I used to have issues with her, and as I grew older, I came to appreciate the power of Paglia, because she has really given necessary critique to feminism today. For many of the reasons you just mentioned, especially the way that feminism has become a very bourgeois undertaking. You see it here in Italy. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous how feminism in Italy focuses invariably on the chador, the hijab. Now, let's not deal with problems of women in Italy. Let's pretend that we can solve problems of women in Iran and even call them problems, because, to paraphrase Gayatri Spivak, the subaltern can speak, right? And then you have this additional problem, which, as an anthropologist, I find fascinating, how they've taken the word patriarchy, which was used within the fields of sociology, anthropology, to discuss a pattern, but it was a kind of analytical framework. It was not supposed to be ever a real, in terms of, now we've got what I call the patriarchy ate my homework. So when feminists have a problem, it's the patriarchy. Oh, you didn't let me finish my sentence because the patriarchy. manspreading the patriarchy, when in fact, I would say almost every single inequality that women face are very much related to the lower middle class, the poor, the lumpenproletariat, and as you have probably noticed on social media, since 2 years plus now, the genocide in Gaza has ripped apart the gender critical feminist groupings throughout the Anglophone world, such that, on the one hand, they decry these men who identify as women and they criticize them correctly by saying, us saying that you're a man is not murder, because circa 2013 to 2017, the trans activists would accuse feminists of murdering them literally. These are quotes from Twitter. And the idea was, no, words actually don't murder. That's not a thing. But now feminists have taken this to the 180-degree measure when it comes to Gaza. Most gender-critical feminists, if you take a gander over social media, are very much what some would call Zio-feminists or what I call genocide feminists. And I've even stated more recently that they've put the nail in their own coffin. Who will take feminism seriously when you have gotten behind a genocide and you've allowed the Hasbara from Israel, which has astroturfed the narrative of the rapist Palestinian, the alleged rapes from 7 October, which have been completely debunked by dozens of journalists, most notably Aaron Mate, Max Blumenthal, Mondo Weiss. Even there was a huge seizure in the newsroom at the New York Times when they ran that story that ended up being fake news because they got a phone call from the family saying, our daughter wasn't raped. Yet here you have feminists screaming up and down, calling me an anti-Semite, a rape enabler, a ball palmer. I can go on. It's rather funny. And they call me these names, and then they invoke rape upon me. I've had this happen a dozen times, if not many more. Oh, well, you just go there to Gaza and see what happens to you. Or you go to Iran and see what happens to you. Now, it's paradoxical, of course. To do with women's rights, there is no empowerment with Western feminism. It's about correcting certain historical misdeeds, but is now a victim narrative almost entirely. It's about comparative oppressions. And then they wonder why the transgender movement erupted, taking on their own rule book.
Oh yeah, that's really wonderful. I think I see lots of convergence. It's curious that you mentioned Camille Paglia because my wife went to Yale 1 year before me, and during that year she was in the same dorm as Camille Paglia. So, and they became very good friends then. And then I met her, and she became then a very controversial all along the years. And yeah, she was vilified, as you know. And today, many people have to step back and say, well, let's analyze Camille. Because the perversities of recent times force us to pay attention to some of the ideas. Some of them could be very exaggerated in a way because it's Camille's style, but the Camille's content, that's what interests me. Well, I think that you are right, and that's because of this that I'm at this current moment, I'm revising my theory. Quite frankly, I think that instead of 3 dominations, I think that capitalism, the 2 basic forms of domination is capitalism and colonialism, because those are very entrenched in the political economy of the world. So they are not so prone or vulnerable to be used by neoliberal politics and neoliberal ideologies. While the link between political economy and patriarchy, because of the heterogeneity of the social group called women, or sexual orientations now and so on, with all the difference between sex and gender and all the different genders and sexual orientations. In fact, the connection with the political economy is completely lost, with a great danger is that the real victims, so to say, because every year 30 women are assassinated by their partners in Portugal. Every year. But it's not visible. People don't talk about that. Talk once a year, they said statistics this year. So all this fuss and all this identity politics in anything, the way in which we write our books these days, because I publish in the United States, and what kind of, politically correct language you have to use sometimes becomes almost unintelligible. The way particularly some journals, forced us to be inclusive in terms of writing. This has nothing to do with the real struggles of the real women on the ground, as I see them. And even in Europe today, the women, in fact, in many countries, earn less than men for the same type of labor. This is not part of the struggle, because the enemy is not capitalism, is the heterosexual white man. Basically, that's what it is. So that's the perversity, is that the enemy has been replaced. And then if the enemy is the heterosexual white man, then the connection with the class struggle is completely lost. And therefore, I ask myself, why was it so easy for Open Society, for George Soros, for the USAID, and for Ford Foundation to pick up on this struggle and convert it in the great struggle, their progressive side, their progressive credentials are this type of feminism, when, in my experience, even in the early 2000s, the indigenous women or the poor women in Brazil or in Chile or in Peru, they didn't want to call themselves feminists, even though they were struggling for their rights, because they said feminism is a white middle-class women's struggle. We are not feminists in that sense. We are women struggling for our rights in our communities without abandoning our culture. Because we noticed that in the indigenous communities, the women didn't play as an important role as men. And in Africa, of course, in my work in South Africa, the women, even though they are the ones that work in the agriculture, they had no title, the right to the title, the property of the land. And that was the big struggle after 1994. And in Mozambique today, they are entitled also, but they were not before. So these are the real struggles of the real women in the world, and they are the ones that are connected with the class struggle in general. So, but they are the ones that are invisible these days, are becoming more invisible. So I think that we have to do certain things, and the thing is probably patriarchy must be subjected to a Marxist critique, because it is behind the worst kind of identity politics that you can imagine. Is really what is sabotaging many of our struggles, because some of the leftist parties have bought this ideology, and therefore they are dividing. We in Portugal had a leftist group, like in Spain, Podemos, in Portugal, the leftist bloc, which I helped both of them in the beginning, and they were, for a time, the third political force. They are reduced to 2% of the electorate. Why? Well, because in fact they committed suicide. It's not the privilege of the right. It's the fault of their policies that went to the easy struggles where they could really have echo with the people on the right without knowing that they were playing the right's game. And now they are, you know, caged in that struggle and they don't get out. And that's why I think that probably patriarchy has to be submitted to a Marxist critique, which is not easy to make because we have wonderful and many women, Marxist women, that have problems with that, and it will be a dialogue which I would be very much interested in pursuing, because I think that if it is not a form of domination, but a form of identity, of narcissistic identity, against false forms of domination to occult real forms of domination, that, is a fifth column that we have in our struggles. And that's what I'm most concerned with at the point. I think that today there are people that are thinking like you, like me, and they are becoming more critical of these issues. And I think that's the way we have to do. I think that theory, in fact, is never self-created. The theory is a product of the changing circumstances of our struggles, and so we have to really adapt all the time. I'm a Spinozean on this. I think that it is the body that conducts our minds, and therefore, because they are a unity, I think that we have to probably to adapt there. I agree with you.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. We've been running a series on Spinoza lately, and it's made me think about some of the benefits of Sufi philosophy, back to Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, but I will not diverge at the moment. I wanted to continue some of your thoughts here because I really loved what you said, the narcissism of belongingness. Beautiful. I'm going to use that and quote you. I've been thinking a lot about your article, Cancellation, Inquisition, and Fatwa, where you discuss an issue that is dear to our readers, because I've been spending since 2012, most of the last 13 years, researching and writing about cancel culture around women who say, you're not a man, we don't want men in our changing rooms or our prisons, and we have the right to call you men without losing our jobs. And there's been, you've seen this probably in the media, many issues with the police showing up at people's doorsteps. The renowned writer Grant Linehan faced arrest when he arrived at Heathrow last month for, again, having something to say, most politely and truthfully, but now one cannot speak directly to this issue without facing cancellation. He was also canceled. One can also lose family members and friends. Loads of women have recounted losing people, including their own children, to gender ideology. Yet the same feminists who are very clear, very material in evoking their thoughts about biological reality, on the other hand, there's something quite ironic when they are canceled for saying that men are not women, and then at the same time, and this was shocking to me, they support cancel culture around that Believe All Women moniker and the movement that erupted around 2017, the Me Too movement, when Russell Brand was accused 2 years ago of sexual improprieties and then has since been charged with rape and so forth. You get all these women on your timeline saying, I knew he was a rapist. And I'm thinking, wait a sec, what happened to due process? Number one. And then I backstory this with Germaine Greer. About 8 years ago, she was quoted in an interview, and the interview was disseminated widely, and then somehow the feminists stopped disseminating it. In the interview, she states very clearly, and I'm paraphrasing here, that rape is one of these realities that necessitates due process, but because of the way in which such crimes happen, it's rare that you're going to have the observer there to say, yes, that really happened. And she says this is something that women have to start taking responsibility for themselves and start thinking about living with this reality. And she wasn't saying that rape is okay or none of this, but they freaked out and said she's victim blaming. So we've got these very bizarre, I guess, crossroads intellectually, where on the one hand, you've got this language of self-definition that feminists find brutal and that has, in fact, chipped away at their rights, because for a long time, women would be in hospitals with the men next to them and they could say nothing. When women said something, they were told, go and find help elsewhere. You can go to another homeless shelter if you don't like that a man's here. And then on the other hand, they are evoking this kind of guilty by birth where all men are presumed to be potential rapists. I kid you not, I was invited to give a paper at a feminist conference many years ago, not so long, it was around 2017-18. And when I accepted, and I'm like, okay, but I have 2 children to bring, and they were like, are they both girls? And I said, no, my son is 2 years old. I couldn't bring him because I was told that he represented a potential rapist. And I said, yeah, right, haha. And I thought they were pranking me. And no, they were for real. I wrote a piece about this because I just thought, oh my God, if this is feminism, no wonder they have so few people in the pews, if you catch my drift. At the same time, there's been some serious problems with the believe all women, even from self-proclaimed feminists, and women like, I remember Catherine Deneuve came out and she said, wait a second, everything that is happening is not rape. Men doing XYZ, and she gave some examples, even flirtation, that is not sexual harassment. And there's this kind of demand to sterilize all human interaction and or eviscerate emotion from it, such that we have to have little permission slips. I agree to touch your hand and whatnot. And I think that there's a real hysteria that has besought the feminist movement where we have to worry about, first of all, men suffer, the process is the punishment. This is what the feminists like to say about the trans activists canceling them. But men suffer this too, because false accusations of sexual assault and rape are not as infrequent as these feminists maintain. And I have real problems with this, where we can't talk about reality. So in your essay, Cancellation, Inquisition, and Fatwa, you say, I'm quoting you, cancellation is a punishment for ideas or conduct considered unacceptable, immoral, or illegal. All societies have had means, procedures, and institutions charged with investigating the nature of ideas and conduct and imposing the appropriate punishment. Differences in means, procedures, and institutions are what distinguish societies. End quote. So I've been thinking a lot about this essay and this quote, where on the one hand, I see a highly moralizing generation which gazes upon behavior as if the Grand Inquisitioner, whereby his or her social media accounts, should they have sufficient numbers of followers, become these sirens that oust the evil amongst us. Everyone, look at what she wrote. I've been called a rape apologist, I've mentioned earlier, about my views on Gaza. And there seems to be no allocation, no room made for discussion, to nuance, for people to be mistaken even, and perhaps that the accuser might have lied, even imagined what happened. For what we have witnessed with the rise of Me Too, since the Me Too movement was founded in 2006 by this American activist, Tarana Burke, to provide a framework of empathy and support for survivors of sexual violence, this movement has morphed into a grotesque excuse to hold public rituals of defamation where there is zero accountability for the woman, but where men, again, guilty at birth, face an enormous threat of guilt by simply existing. So in the same social plateau, for understanding how Me Too has become this public lynching tool for the general sphere to utilize social media in order to have a voice, this has led to a complete abandon of due process, which I think we should all hold dear. Also, that women are committing this kind of own goal. Because if we believe all women, I've got news for the feminists. My story is horrible. For the past 2 years, our listeners will notice I've been very absent. I was in a marriage with a woman who was violent, who has, I learned only recently, been stalking me from the beginning of our marriage until now. It's been horrific. I've had to go to the police, and it's insane the amount of research I've had to do. When you are two women in a country like Italy, I can't even tell you the kind of comments that are made. But the feminists don't know what to do when I point out that I was married to a grifter who was psychologically abusive, who, this all started during lockdown, who did Darvo on me. Darvo is that feminist expression of basically reversing who's the victim and who's the victimizer, who was very abusive. We lived with daily insults at times, racist, homophobic. This person told her family that I was her boss. She robbed me. I mean, it was horrible, but of course the whole time I was being told I have a mental problem, I'm seeing a psychiatrist. And of course, when you love someone, you want to support them. I was able to deflect the misbehavior towards my children very early on, but all of that came to me. So when I speak to feminists about this, you know what they tell me? Well, at least you weren't killed. Thank you very much, but the psychological trauma of being with someone who was so abusive and went so far as to even try to subvert our divorce by making a false, what's called in Italy, a warning. She wanted to have the divorce in her favor so she could continue to rob me, and had a warning made with all the accusations that she had done to me. It's brilliant the SMS exists. I've got a logbook of this person's calumny and defamation, but the reality is that the psychological pressure and the psychological suffering that is done when you are accused of something that obviously you never did, and that you are now proceeding against this person for calumny, defamation, and stalking, that she said I was stalking her while she was stalking me. I mean, it's that crazy. So when feminists say male violence, I'm like, we need to stop that term. There is violence. There is violence. I worked in trafficking of children in Haiti after the 2010 gudu, what they call the earthquake. Many of the human traffickers of children were women, one of whom was extremely high up, a minister in the Haitian government. So there's an idea that the patriarchy made me do it, male violence. I think it's worn thin, especially in light of Gaza, with all these feminists cheerleading a genocide. What are your thoughts?
Oh my God, Julian, it's a wonderful. I've got to know more of your work. I mean, you have to send me some of your papers, because this will,
I shall.
You'll encourage me to write about this, because you know that for a man to write about these things today is even more difficult. And as you know, what you are saying, resonates very well in my own experience. And it is terrible what's going on, because first of all, cancel culture is fascism, because I think that you cannot, in fact, go on with denunciations that you don't have to prove. You don't have to say, I would say whatever you want to say, actually, and you say it in usually using vehicles that there is no possible defense for the other person, be they the press or be they the social networks. And they never go to courts because they don't trust courts. Courts are also male chauvinists and so on. And it is really an impossible type of struggle for the people that are in fact object of this type of insults. And I have already, in my own part, and very dramatic in a sense, because I think it is a complete perversity. Because first of all, we are in a time in which women never lie. Men lie all the time. And therefore, we have always this problem. Uh, in your case, it's more complicated because it's women, women, so to say. But if it is a man, women, that's absolutely clear. Women don't lie. So if they say whatever they want, they're right because they say. And so this is very dangerous because they lie as much as men lie. So I think that they should, a new feminism would start from a colleague of mine, a great feminist from Argentina, is a good friend of mine, and has just sent me a message, Norma Fernandez from Cordoba, and said, "Look, Boa, the people call me Boa because Boaventura is too long. Boa, they start in the United States calling me Boa. Well, Boa, the problem is that if we don't do a serious debate within feminism about this question of lying, about the questions of victims, because why are the women victims? If you are interested in empowerment, the victim is the idea that is the innocent person that doesn't do anything, contributes nothing to the type of event that she is being involved in. So this idea is almost counterproductive, is nonsensical, because you are converted into some inert res extensa in Descartes' term, which is not this idea that all of us have this potentia in Spinozean terms, and women have the potentia as men have. And of course, there are discrimination. We know that very well. The real one related to the political economy of our societies. So this idea of that women have a lie is terrible and is really, in my view, in the long run, it will kill the feminist movement because the people, the suffering that they are causing. I can imagine the suffering we have gone through. I have also my part in this type of thing, and it's not what is really most dramatic is that whenever you prove the falsities of these denunciations, for instance, and I've proved every denunciation is false in my case, as far as I can see, people don't read them anymore. People have a kind of a narrative in their minds, and this narrative is not to be challenged because they do not want to confront the idea that they were wrong in the first place. So this idea of non-correctness, on the possibility of correcting myself because I was wrong, which is, a basic idea in democracy, the humility that, I'm sorry, I felt this way, but, in light of the facts and things that we have presented, this is not true. Well, this is really a situation in which we are that is almost turns us, in fact, we become very much victims in the sense that it's impossible. There is no way out because the courts are not there very often, either because there is no criminal charges or no other charges against you. And if you bring charges against the people that are defaming you, the charges will take forever. And therefore, your health is damaged, your reputation is damaged, and the damage is done. That's the problem, is the damage is instantaneous, is immediate, and crushes your life and your reputation. So it is part of the times in which we are, Julian. It's part of these proto-fascistic regimes of social relations in which we are not able to what Ivan Illich called the conviviality anymore. The simple relations of love, of friendship, which sometimes, of course, there are love declarations. They are, what is just to tell you that because no woman ever accused any intimate contact with me, never. But they say that, for instance, my hugs was too strong. My hugs. What is a too strong hug? I mean, it is ridiculous. Or because my kisses were close to the mouth. Can you imagine this? I mean, this is ridiculous in the face of it.
Well, obviously, people have agency. People can say, hey, I've done it. I've had people at my house, and I'm like, can you please not put your phone on the table? I'm very direct. The phone is not a fork. Yeah. And so, I try to be very upfront with people. As a New Yorker, I'm not bad at that. But I do think that my sympathy has worn out, not just because of what I experienced recently. I mean, being stalked by someone who's sending you messages of let's make love after they've accused you of horrible things. I want to see the children. I don't think so. That's insane on a personal level. But I think that there's a certain gullibility within feminism because of the woman as victim sequence. They've entered this into the database, and a lot of women will not relinquish this power. And it is for them a power, even though they do not understand that that's not power. That's disempowerment. And I'm not saying own your sexual assault and be proud of it. I'm saying something quite different. I think there is power in truth. And I think that we need to acknowledge not just rape, there are loads of crimes that are not provable. I became very interested in the Gacaca courts in Rwanda after the Hutu and Tutsi genocide. These courts were made because there were simply not enough human judges to deal with the enormity of human rights violations of rape and murder. And they had to have justice. This is what I'm facing. I told my lawyer recently, I said, oh my God, no wonder the law in the courtroom was created, because I can only imagine that someone in my position before the modern era of the justice system would have had his or her clan go and kill the person that did them wrong. And you need justice. So the Gacaca courts in Rwanda served as an informal way of dealing with mostly rape cases where the accused stood before the victim and the alleged accused stood before the alleged victim. And in those cases were too many, and it was horrific. And we all remember reading the stories and seeing the news on this. But I think the problem with cancel culture is it's not even being as subtle as these Gacaca courts. At least the Gacaca courts enabled a dialogue. What's happening online and what's happening in feminist conferences also is male violence, full stop. There is no consideration that women are violent, that women lie, that women make false accusations, that women are abusive to children, that women use all sorts of violence, not just physical, but emotional, and even gaslighting, something I know very well about now, and that this isn't quite acknowledged in law in many countries. Gaslighting was just used, I believe, for the first time, and the person found guilty of gaslighting, it was in a British trial, I believe it was last year, and the person accused and found guilty was a woman. So I think that feminism has a problem in addressing the female victimizer, because they've perfectly modeled their narrative around, and uniquely, the female victim. And that's a problem.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the problem is precisely that, because I think that if you are just the victim, first of all, you have the possibility of saying no. You are not an entity that can resist. You are not an active human being that can be trusted in a struggle, for instance, collective struggle, because you are just the victim as powerlessness. So I think that is really perverse, because it runs against, counterproductive to any kind of the idea of struggle, which for us is the basic idea. And we have to really be courageous enough. And I appreciate what you say, and because you are right, the cancel culture is more fascistic than the Inquisition, because in the Inquisition there are arguments at least. There was a lawyer there. In fact, the lawyer didn't play a very important role, and the people were tortured to confess. We know all that, and I say that in the article. But at least it was a process, a procedure, and there was the appearance that there is some, and some people in fact were acquitted from those crimes that were the apostasy, particularly with the new Christians and so on. It's a long story. I have studied the Inquisition for a long time, and then I saw that probably it should be interesting because the Inquisition is part of what we call the Dark Middle Ages and so on. And all of a sudden, here we are in a society which is most advanced, and as we considered it to be, even though is on the verge of ecological collapse and probably a third global war, but we still go on saying that we are very progressive and we are very advanced and very civilized, and you have a mechanism which is pure fascism because it consists in destroying people, the lives of people, without any possible defense. Any presumption of innocence, of course, is not there, and procedure is not there. I think that is part of this. What I never thought that my theories would be as true as they have become in recent times, because in the 90s, early 20s, in the book Toward a New Common Sense, published by Routledge in New York, I made a distinction between political fascism and societal or social fascism. And the idea is that liberal democracy is an island of democracy in an archipelago of despotisms in the family, in the community, in the market, in the production and international relations. So we have just political democracy and then fascisms all over the place. I think this idea of social fascism, which may turn and slide into political fascism very soon, is probably more useful now than probably when I analyze it, because we are being the thing that is most dangerous to us is that we are disarmed, because I was trained for the anti-fascistic struggles, because I lived in the political fascistic struggle in my adult life. And I was against colonialism and against fascism, and that's why I ended up in the United States and so on. But this fascism is very difficult to struggle against because we are in democratic societies. And people think that we are in democracy, we have rights and so on, and therefore these injustices are just rotten apples, and it's not systematic. The problem is becoming systemic, and is part of the primitive accumulation of the bodies of people, of the reputation of people, of the health of people, of the family, as in your case with your two children of people. So there is form of an annihilation that is taking place that they are more subtle in appearance, they are more insidious in their results, and probably even more cruel because they destroy under the appearance of a just cause. The problem that we are facing is that some of the tools that we invent and struggle for turn against us, or become the tools of our enemies. And I think that probably what has to do is that we how shall I formulate this? I think that the theoretical, we are not inaugural generations. That is to say, the generations that are at the beginning of an age, and therefore they are very innovative, creative, and they think they are doing something. These inaugural generations, we saw them in 1917 in Russia and so on, and many other contexts. With all the problems that we know, we are not naive anymore. But in fact, there was this creativity, intellectual creativity, because at the time they were courageous enough, and they were very, very strong debates at the time, and we know all the when we read that the debates of even the first generation of revolutionaries in the Soviet Revolution with Kollontai and other, and the Krupskaya, the Lenin's wife, and so on, we know how aware they were of the difference between men and women and the struggles, and we have to, establish a kind of an hierarchy in the struggles. We may be together for this struggle, but we are not together in this struggle, because in fact that's the idea that in our societies we have not done, and I think that this society we are not doing enough work on defining who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. Because, of course, as I say in one of my books, all the oppressed are sometimes also oppressors. I mean, the working class guy arrives at home and beats the wife. I mean, he's an oppressed in the plant, and then is an oppressor at home. So these things happen. So that's the complexity. It's not a black and white type of thing. We have to be for complexity. And then we have to analyze situations in which we are more of an oppressor than oppressed, or on the contrary, if you are more oppressed than oppressor. And I think that that's the main issue in which we are involved now. Because if you see the black and white, and women are always oppressed, and this note that touched me a lot when you said that in this meeting of feminists, because one of your children is a boy, is a potential rapist. My God, I mean, this is lunatic. I mean, this is not normal anymore. Is something else. So I think that we have to go back to the idea of the class struggle, of oppression. We had always a distinction in Marxism, which we have not elaborated on sufficiently, is a distinction between domination and oppression. In domination would be there is a direct relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, like the owner of the plant and the worker, and or in the mine, the owner of the mine and the miner. So this is a direct exploitation relationship. While in the oppression, the oppression is that there must be probably. There are sometimes not direct relationships, but they are. The relationship that you were mentioning, they are direct relationship between people, between individuals, and so on. So I think that we have to distinguish different forms of domination and of oppression to account for this, because everything is being, if everything is oppression, nothing is oppression. If everything is domination, nothing is domination. We are trivializing, in fact, domination and oppression at this present time. And when these excesses that we have, I would call excesses, and I think you would also call them, that you have narrating and you have been encountering even in these discussions on Gaza, on the genocide, I mean, these are really not helpful. They're helpful to the extent they will probably become occasions in which we could sit down, probably in a conversation, but in a conversation not with many people, probably, um, and probably presential. I'm today more and more in favor of presential conversations, not mediated by any electronic medium. Then we can see people face to face and discuss serious issues that I think have to be addressed. And I think the hierarchy of among oppressions, which I felt that I had solved in a sense, that the most oppressed people in our world would be those that were subjected to the three dominations, because they were poor, because they were black, because they were women. So there are people that are just oppressed in one domination, maybe oppressors in the other two, and there are other people that are oppressed in the three of them. And these would be the ones that would be probably the most reliable for a kind of a revolution, so to say, right? But they are the ones that usually are less capable of getting into that struggle, because there is always someone else speaking in their own name, and they don't speak in their own name. So I think these are the issues yeah, I know that many of them come from the 20th century, but they now in the 21st century, which I don't think has started yet, in a sense. I see the same problems, probably a global war or a ecological collapse, so the bad news would inaugurate a new age, which is terrible for leftists to think about, that the only possible thing is, and we have known, I mean, Alain Badiou has also shown that the great transformations always take place either in wars or in revolutions.